On January 3rd, 1889, in a street in Turin, a 44-year-old philosopher threw his arms around the neck of a horse that was being whipped by its owner, collapsed sobbing to the ground, and never spoke a coherent sentence again. The man was Friedrich Nietzsche, and for the next 11 years until his death, the mind that had declared God dead and demanded humanity reinvent itself would remain silent, vacant, cared for by his mother and sister like a child. This is the complete story of Friedrich Nietzsche, the son of a pastor who became philosophy's greatest iconoclast, the thinker who diagnosed European nihilism and prescribed a radical cure, and the writer whose ideas about will to power, eternal recurrence, and the Übermensch would be twisted, celebrated, and misunderstood for more than a century. We will follow his evolution from classical philologist to philosophical revolutionary, trace the development of his core ideas across his major works, and examine why his philosophy remains both dangerous and necessary. From his first scandalous book on Greek tragedy published when he was 27, through his rupture with Richard Wagner and the metaphysical comfort of his youth, to the astonishing productivity of his final sane year, when he wrote 4 books, including one titled Why I Am So Wise, we will understand not just what Nietzsche said, but why it mattered then, and why it might matter even more now. The collapse in Turin was not the beginning of the story, though it has become the image most associated with Nietzsche, the madman who stared too long into the abyss and lost himself. But that convenient narrative misses what makes Nietzsche genuinely unsettling. He did not go mad because his philosophy was too extreme for a human mind to bear. He went mad, most likely, because of a disease, possibly syphilis, possibly a brain tumor, certainly something organic and medical rather than metaphysical. The tragedy is not that his ideas destroyed him. The tragedy is that they might have been right, and his destruction had nothing to do with their truth or falsity. For 11 years, the man who had written that God is dead and we have killed him, that humanity must overcome itself, that the secret of the greatest fruitfulness lies in the words amor fati, love your fate, existed in a state beyond language, beyond argument, beyond the very consciousness that had produced those ideas. His mother, a devout Christian, cared for him with exactly the compassion and pity he had spent decades attacking as weakness. There is something almost unbearably human in that irony. But before the horse, before the silence, there had been the books, and the books were extraordinary. Nietzsche wrote with an aphoristic brilliance that made him quotable and dangerous in equal measure. God is dead. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. He who fights with monsters should look to it, that he himself does not become a monster. When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. These lines have escaped their context and become cultural commonplaces, deployed in everything from political speeches to superhero films, usually by people who have not read the works they come from and would be disturbed if they did, because Nietzsche was not offering self-help wisdom or inspirational guidance. He was performing a vivisection on Western civilization, diagnosing what he saw as a terminal illness and prescribing a cure that most patients would find worse than the disease. The illness, as he understood it, was nihilism, the growing realization that the values European culture had organized itself around for 2,000 years, values derived from Christianity and Platonic philosophy, were collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. Science and historical scholarship, both products of the intellectual honesty Christianity had cultivated in its search for truth, had turned that honesty back on Christianity itself and found it wanting. God was dead, not because atheists had won some argument, but because the entire structure of transcendent meaning that had made God believable had eroded from within, and most people, Nietzsche thought, had not yet understood what this meant. They were still living on the cultural capital of a dead world view, still assuming that values like equality, compassion, and justice were somehow objectively true even after abandoning the metaphysical framework that had grounded them. They were, in his memorable phrase, shadows of God, lingering long after the body had been buried. The cure Nietzsche proposed was not a return to religious faith, which he considered impossible for anyone intellectually honest, and not a descent into passive nihilism, which he considered contemptible. Instead, he demanded something far more difficult, that humanity learn to create values and meaning from within itself, without appeal to anything transcendent, anything outside the world of becoming and struggle and will. This required what he called a revaluation of all values, an examination of where our moral concepts came from, and whether they served life or denied it. And it required the emergence of a new type of human being, one strong enough to affirm existence as it is, without cosmic purpose or divine plan, and to say yes to life so completely that one would will its eternal return, would choose to live the exact same life, with all its suffering and absurdity, infinitely many times. He called this hypothetical being the Übermensch, the overman, the human who had overcome humanity as it currently existed. You might recognize these ideas, or think you do. They have been appropriated by fascists and anarchists, by self-help gurus and postmodern theorists, by nihilists who saw in Nietzsche permission for cruelty, and by existentialists who saw in him the demand for authentic responsibility. The Nazi regime celebrated him as a prophet of will to power and Aryan supremacy, conveniently ignoring his contempt for German nationalism and anti-Semitism, his admiration for Jewish intellectuals, and his vision of a European culture that would transcend tribal identities. After the war, scholars worked to recover the actual Nietzsche from the ideological distortions, and what they found was more complex, more careful, and more disturbing than either his appropriators or his critics had acknowledged. This philosopher, who wrote with such rhetorical force, was also a philologist who cared deeply about textual precision. This prophet of strength and hardness also wrote with extraordinary psychological subtlety about suffering, vulnerability, and the human need for illusion. This attacker of compassion wrote the scene of Zarathustra weeping over the higher men. The contradictions were not accidents but features of a mind that refused easy systematization. What follows is an attempt to understand that mind, to trace its development from the childhood trauma of watching his pastor father descend into madness and death, through his meteoric early academic career and shocking first book on Greek tragedy, to his break with Wagner and metaphysics, to the radical solitude of his mature period, when he wrote his most important works while suffering from crushing headaches and near blindness, to the final explosive year before collapse. We will read him carefully, in context, with attention to what he actually wrote, rather than what has been claimed about him. We will examine the origins of his core concepts: will to power, eternal recurrence, master and slave morality, the death of God, the Übermensch. We will consider both the genuine insights and the genuine dangers in his thought, and we will ask what his philosophy offers to anyone now grappling with the same question he faced: how to create meaning and value in a universe that offers no inherent purpose, no cosmic reassurance, no foundation beyond what we build from will and honesty, and the refusal to lie about what we see. The story begins not in Turin but in a small Prussian village, with a boy who lost his father and spent his childhood among women who expected him to become a pastor like the generations before him, never imagining he would become the man who declared their God dead and demanded they create themselves anew from the ruins. The village of Recurrence sits in the flat agricultural lands of Prussian Saxony, a landscape of wheat fields and Lutheran church spires where tradition runs as deep as the furrows in the soil. Here, in the parsonage beside the Church of St. Mary, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche served as pastor, as his father had before him. On October 15th, 1844, his wife Franziska gave birth to their first child, a son they named Friedrich Wilhelm after the Prussian king, whose birthday fell on the same day. The boy entered a world of hymns and scripture, of pastoral visits and theological certainty, of rituals that marked the rhythm of village life from baptism to burial. It was precisely the kind of world he would spend his adult life trying to escape, though the escape would never be complete. The preacher's voice, the cadence of religious language, the prophetic tone of moral pronouncement, these would remain in his bones even as he inverted every value they represented. 4 years later, the structure collapsed. Karl Ludwig Nietzsche began showing signs of what contemporary physicians vaguely termed a brain ailment: headaches, vision problems, seizures. The symptoms progressed rapidly. The pastor, who had presided over the spiritual lives of his congregation with such authority, became confused, incoherent, unable to perform his duties. Friedrich watched his father's decline with the uncomprehending terror of a child witnessing the disintegration of his first model of strength and order. In July of 1849, Karl Ludwig died. He was 36 years old. The cause listed on official records was softening of the brain, a diagnosis that covered a multitude of possible conditions from tumor to infection to stroke. Less than a year later, Friedrich's younger brother Joseph also died, leaving the boy as the only male in a household suddenly composed of his mother, his younger sister Elizabeth, his paternal grandmother, and two maiden aunts. The psychological impact of this double loss can only be inferred, but certain patterns suggest themselves. Friedrich became the center of female attention and expectation, simultaneously coddled and burdened with the hope that he would redeem the family tragedy by following his father and grandfather into the ministry. He showed early signs of exceptional intellectual ability and a disposition toward intense, almost theatrical piety. His childhood writings are full of religious devotion expressed with such fervor that even his teachers found it somewhat excessive. He composed prayers, hymns, and devotional essays with the solemn seriousness of a boy trying to live up to a dead father's calling. But beneath the piety, something else was forming. A child who has watched a pastor father descend into confusion and death, who has seen the man who spoke with divine authority reduced to helplessness, has received an education in the fragility of all authority, even God's. The lesson may take years to surface, but it has been learned. The family moved to Nuremberg, where Friedrich attended the cathedral school, and then at age 14 won admission to Schulporte, one of Germany's most prestigious boarding schools. The institution had a tradition of rigorous classical education dating back to the Reformation, and here Nietzsche received the foundation that would make him one of the finest philologists of his generation. He learned Greek and Latin with exceptional facility, read Homer and Plato in the original, absorbed the methods of textual criticism that train students to question every manuscript tradition and trace every corrupted text back toward its origin. This was the golden age of German classical scholarship, when men like Friedrich August Wolff and Karl Lachmann had transformed the study of ancient texts into a scientific discipline. The young Nietzsche excelled in this world, but he also discovered something that would prove more dangerous than philology: German philosophy and music. He read Friedrich Hölderlin's poetry and felt the vertigo of a modern mind trying to resurrect Greek tragedy. He discovered Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation by Chance in a bookshop, bought it on impulse, and found in its pages a metaphysical vision that seemed to speak directly to his own intuitions about suffering will and the illusory nature of individuation. And he fell under the spell of Richard Wagner's music dramas, hearing in them the possibility of a rebirth of tragic culture that might redeem modern European civilization from its shallow rationalism and empty Christianity. These were not the approved materials for a future pastor or even a conventional classicist. They represented the romantic, metaphysical, intensely Germanic strain of thought that stood opposed to the dry textual scholarship he was being trained to perform. The tension between these two impulses, rigorous academic discipline and intoxicated philosophical speculation, would define his entire career. In 1864, Nietzsche enrolled at the University of Bonn to study theology and classical philology. Within a semester, he abandoned theology. The decision devastated his mother and signaled his quiet break with the religious expectations that had shaped his childhood. He followed his favorite professor, Friedrich Nietzsche, to Leipzig and devoted himself entirely to philological studies. Here his exceptional abilities became undeniable. He published articles on ancient sources, impressed his professors with his command of Greek dialects and textual problems, and earned a reputation as the most promising student of his generation. When the University of Basel needed a professor of classical philology in 1869, Ritschl recommended the 24-year-old Nietzsche in such extraordinary terms that the university made an offer before Nietzsche had even completed his doctoral dissertation. Leipzig awarded him a doctorate without examination based on his published work, and he arrived in Basel that spring as the youngest professor in the university's history. But this is where the conventional success story begins to crack. The same year he arrived in Basel, Nietzsche's health began its long decline. Severe headaches, eye pain, digestive problems, bouts of vomiting that could last for days. He would spend much of the next 2 decades in near constant physical suffering, taking leaves from teaching, trying various cures at health spas, experimenting with diets and medications that offered little relief. The exact nature of his illness has been debated endlessly: syphilis, brain tumor, migraine disorder, cluster headaches, psychological illness manifesting as physical symptoms. What matters is that this brilliant young professor, with every reason to expect a distinguished conventional career, was instead driven into increasing isolation by a body that would not cooperate with academic life. He would serve at Basel for only 10 years before resigning in 1879, never to hold an institutional position again. The rest of his productive life would be spent in boarding houses and rented rooms in Switzerland and Italy, writing during the brief windows when his health permitted, supported by a small pension and his mother's frugality. But before the resignation, before the wandering years of solitude and suffering, the young professor had to navigate the intellectual landscape of 1860s Germany. This was a culture in profound transition, caught between the grand metaphysical systems of German idealism and the rising tide of scientific materialism. Hegel's attempt to show that history itself was the unfolding of absolute spirit had dominated German philosophy for decades, but by mid-century, a reaction had set in. Ludwig Feuerbach argued that theology was simply anthropology in disguise, that humans had created God in their own image and then forgotten they were worshipping themselves. David Friedrich Strauss's Life of Jesus had subjected the Gospels to historical criticism and concluded they were myths rather than eyewitness accounts. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published when Nietzsche was 15, had provided a naturalistic account of human origins that required no divine intervention. Materialism was ascendant, arguing that consciousness was merely a product of matter in motion, that the soul was an illusion, that there was nothing in the universe but atoms and void. The spiritual certainties that had organized European life for centuries were dissolving, and thoughtful people could feel the foundations shifting beneath them. Most either clung to the old beliefs with increasing desperation, or embraced the new scientific worldview and assumed that rationality and progress would fill the gap left by God's departure. Nietzsche would come to see that both responses missed the true scale of the catastrophe. But the brilliant young philologist who arrived at Basel was already harboring doubts about the classical scholarship he was trained to perform. His first book would shock the academic world and set him on a path towards something far more dangerous than textual criticism. In 1872, the 27-year-old professor of classical philology at the University of Basel published a book that would destroy his academic reputation before he had properly established one. The birth of tragedy from the spirit of music arrived in scholarly circles like a manifesto written in a language philologists did not recognize. Where his colleagues expected meticulous textual analysis and careful footnotes, Nietzsche offered a sweeping psychological theory about the inner forces that drove Greek culture. Where they wanted evidence, he gave them vision. The book was not merely unconventional, it was a betrayal of everything classical scholarship claimed to be. The core argument sounds simple enough at first. Greek tragedy, Nietzsche proposed, emerged from the fusion of two fundamental drives he named after Greek gods. The Apollonian impulse after Apollo, the god of light and reason, represented everything ordered, measured, and beautiful. It was the drive toward form, toward clarity, toward individuation. When you looked at a Greek statue and saw the human form rendered in perfect proportion, you were witnessing the Apollonian at work, the will to make reality comprehensible, to impose boundaries on chaos, to create the illusion that existence has shape and meaning. The Apollonian gave us dreams, art, philosophy, all the structures that allowed human beings to bear the terror of existence by beautifying it, by making it seem knowable. But Apollo was not the only god who mattered to the Greeks. There was Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, and the Dionysian impulse was something else entirely. It was intoxication rather than clarity, unity rather than individuation, the dissolution of all boundaries between self and world. When you drank too much wine and danced until you forgot your own name, when you lost yourself in music or in the frenzy of ritual, you were experiencing the Dionysian, the recognition that beneath all our beautiful forms and rational categories, existence is a churning unity of becoming, of creation and destruction, of forces that do not care about human meaning. The Dionysian was the truth that the Apollonian existed to conceal. Greek tragedy, according to Nietzsche, achieved its greatness precisely because it held these two forces in balance. The chorus, originally groups of satyrs singing hymns to Dionysus, represented the Dionysian dissolution of identity, the merging into collective ecstasy. But onto this foundation, the Greeks imposed the Apollonian structure of individual characters, plot, beautiful language, the illusion of heroes making meaningful choices. Tragedy allowed its audience to glimpse the Dionysian horror, the fact that suffering is woven into the fabric of existence, but it did so through Apollonian form that made the horror bearable, even beautiful. This was why the Greeks could look directly at terrible truths without collapsing. They had an art form that acknowledged chaos while giving it shape. And then something happened. The balance broke. Socrates appeared on the scene, and with him came a new faith. The belief that existence could be understood through reason alone, that logic could penetrate all mysteries, that truth and goodness were accessible to rational inquiry. Euripides, the last of the great tragedians, brought this Socratic impulse onto the stage. His plays were more rational, more moralistic, more concerned with clear arguments and tidy resolutions. The chorus diminished. The Dionysian element withered. What replaced tragedy was not a higher form, but a shallower one. Drama that taught lessons, that offered comfort, that pretended the universe made sense. This was the great crime in Nietzsche's telling. Socratic rationalism killed tragedy by refusing to accept that some truths cannot be reasoned away. It inaugurated what would become Western civilization's defining characteristic, the flight from uncomfortable reality into abstraction, into systems of thought that promised meaning and morality could be logically demonstrated. Plato would construct his realm of perfect forms. Christianity would later offer its heaven and its divine purpose. Science would promise mastery over nature through understanding. All of them shared the Socratic assumption that reality at bottom is rational, comprehensible, ultimately good. All of them were lies told by people who could not bear what the Dionysian had revealed. The book was brilliant and completely unacceptable. Nietzsche had committed multiple scholarly sins at once. He had based psychological theories on limited evidence. He had mixed philosophy with cultural criticism and aesthetic judgment. He had written in a style that was more poetry than argument. Worst of all, he had suggested that rationality itself, the foundation of all scholarship, was a defense mechanism, a beautiful lie told to ward off terror. His former teacher, the renowned philologist Ulrich von Wilhelmowitz-Moellendorff, published a savage review calling the book unscientific fantasy. Others simply ignored it. Nietzsche found himself increasingly isolated in academic circles. The promising young professor now regarded as someone who had lost his way, who had confused philosophy with literature and classical scholarship with cultural commentary. But the rejection revealed something Nietzsche himself may not have fully recognized yet. He was not actually interested in ancient Greece as a historical puzzle to be solved through careful research. He was interested in it as a mirror, a diagnostic tool. The Greeks had once been strong enough to look at existence without flinching, to create beauty from horror, to say yes to life even knowing it contained inevitable suffering. Modern Europeans had lost that strength. They needed philosophy and religion and science to tell them comforting lies. The Birth of Tragedy was not really a book about Greek drama. It was the opening move in a much larger project, the diagnosis of everything wrong with Western civilization's relationship to truth. The young professor, who had shocked the classical philologists, was about to become something far more dangerous. He had tested his method and discovered his real subject was not the past, but the present, not what the Greeks believed, but what modern Europeans could no longer bear to face. The Birth of Tragedy revealed something crucial about Nietzsche's method. He would use history not to discover what was, but to diagnose what is wrong with the present. His next target would be far more personal. The Birth of Tragedy revealed something crucial about Nietzsche's method. He would use history not to discover what was, but to diagnose what is wrong with the present. His next target would be far more personal. In October of 1865, when Nietzsche was 20 years old and studying philology at Leipzig, He wandered into a second-hand bookshop. His eye caught a volume with a worn spine, The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. He bought it on impulse, carried it home and threw himself onto his sofa to read. He would later say he did not move for 2 weeks except to sleep. When he finally emerged, something fundamental had shifted. He had found not just a philosophy, but a way of being philosophical. Schopenhauer offered the young Nietzsche a vision of unflinching honesty in the face of a meaningless universe. Unlike the comfortable idealism of Hegel that dominated German universities, Schopenhauer saw the world as driven by a blind, purposeless will, an insatiable force that manifested in all living things as desire, suffering, and striving without end. Life was not rational progress toward absolute knowledge. It was endless wanting punctuated by brief satisfactions that only spawned new wants. The only escape Schopenhauer offered was aesthetic contemplation and the eventual denial of the will to live itself, a kind of philosophical suicide that quieted desire through ascetic withdrawal from the world. For Nietzsche, what mattered was not whether Schopenhauer was right, but that he had the courage to follow his thought wherever it led, even into pessimism and despair. Schopenhauer wrote without academic caution, without concern for what his colleagues would think, without the pretense that philosophy should make people feel better about existence. He was ruthlessly honest, and honesty, Nietzsche was beginning to understand, was the rarest philosophical virtue. Here was a thinker who would not lie about suffering to preserve metaphysical comfort. But Schopenhauer's solution, his retreat into denial of life, would eventually become precisely what Nietzsche could not accept. The question that would drive Nietzsche's mature philosophy was already forming. What if we took Schopenhauer's diagnosis of life as suffering and meaningless striving, but rejected his prescription of renunciation? What if we said yes to life anyway? That question remained dormant while Nietzsche pursued a different hope for salvation, not through philosophy, but through art. In November of 1868, he met Richard Wagner at the home of a mutual acquaintance in Leipzig. Wagner was 55, already famous, a cultural force whose operas reimagined German mythology and whose theories of total artwork promised to restore the unity of music, drama, and philosophy that had existed in Greek tragedy. Nietzsche was 24, still a student, but Wagner recognized in this intense young man a brilliant mind and perhaps a disciple. The friendship that developed was extraordinary in its intensity and unequal in its power. Nietzsche visited Wagner's home at Tribschen on Lake Lucerne more than 20 times over the next few years. He spent Christmas there. He became part of Wagner's intimate circle, playing piano, discussing philosophy, listening to Wagner hold forth on his theories of art and culture. For Nietzsche, Wagner embodied everything he had theorized in The Birth of Tragedy. Here was an artist who understood the Dionysian, who could create music that dissolved rational boundaries and touched something primal and overwhelming. More than that, Wagner seemed to offer a path forward for German culture. Nietzsche convinced himself that Wagner's music dramas could accomplish what Schopenhauer's pessimism could not. They could revitalize a culture that had become shallow, rationalistic, overly academic. Wagner would restore tragic wisdom through art. He would teach people to confront life's depths rather than fleeing into comfortable optimism or Christian consolation. The problem was that Nietzsche was projecting onto Wagner what he needed Wagner to be. The real Wagner was increasingly different from Nietzsche's idealized vision. The composer's nationalism, his growing anti-Semitism, his theatrical self-promotion, his manipulation of wealthy patrons, all of this Nietzsche overlooked or rationalized. What he could not overlook forever was the direction of Wagner's art itself. In 1876, Wagner premiered his massive opera cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung, at the specially built Bayreuth Festival Theatre. Nietzsche attended, but the experience disturbed rather than exalted him. The spectacle seemed grandiose and empty. The audience was not transformed but merely entertained, the wealthy and powerful treating the event as a social occasion. Worse, Wagner's next opera, Parsifal, would be explicitly Christian, a tale of redemption through purity and renunciation, through the denial of the flesh and the embrace of suffering as sacred. Nietzsche began to see that Wagner had never truly embraced the tragic affirmation Nietzsche imagined. Wagner's art did not teach people to love life despite its horrors. It taught them to flee life into myth, into religiosity, into the same old Christian denial that Schopenhauer had prescribed in philosophical form. The music that had seemed Dionysian was actually decadent, overly emotional, manipulative. Wagner was not revitalizing German culture but poisoning it with beautiful lies. The break was gradual and painful. Nietzsche stopped visiting Tribschen. He made excuses not to attend Bayreuth again. He felt increasingly ill, though how much was physical and how much was the psychosomatic toll of intellectual betrayal is impossible to separate. To break with Wagner meant breaking with his own younger self, with years of investment and hope, with the father figure he had found after losing his actual father in childhood. In 1878, Nietzsche published Human, All Too Human, and sent a copy to Wagner. The book was a deliberate announcement of independence. Gone was the grand theory of tragedy. Gone was the hope that art could save culture. In their place was something new, a series of aphorisms that dissected human psychology with cool precision, showing how what people called noble motives were usually disguised self-interest, how what seemed like metaphysical truths were actually psychological needs. The book argued that there are no metaphysical truths at all, only human interpretations serving human purposes. Wagner recognized the book as a betrayal and never spoke to Nietzsche again. In later years, Nietzsche would write with venom about Wagner, calling him a disease, an actor, a seducer. Everything wrong with modern culture. The intensity of these attacks revealed how much the relationship had mattered. You do not write with such fury about someone who meant nothing to you. But the break accomplished something essential. Nietzsche had learned that he could not rely on intellectual fathers to provide answers. Schopenhauer's pessimistic honesty was better than idealist lies, but it still ended in life denial. Wagner's artistic grandeur was better than academic dryness, but it still required myth and self-deception. Nietzsche would have to think for himself, without metaphysical comfort, without artistic redemption, without hope that anyone else had solved the problem he was grappling with. Human, All Too Human marked the beginning of what Nietzsche called his free spirit period, when he turned philosophy into psychology, when he began asking not whether ideas were true but why people believed them, what needs those beliefs served, what weaknesses they disguised as strengths. The method he would use for the rest of his productive life was born from the wreckage of his broken idols. He had learnt that reverence was dangerous, that admiration could become a prison, that the hardest thing was to think against everything you had previously believed. The psychological insight that would drive his mature work was also forming resentment, the poisonous emotion of those who cannot act, and so revalue the world to make their weakness into virtue. Nietzsche had felt it himself in the painful years of breaking with Wagner, the temptation to convince himself that what he could not have was not worth having, that Wagner's success was actually failure, that the grapes were sour anyway. The difference was that Nietzsche recognized this mechanism and fought it rather than surrendering to it. With his idols abandoned, Nietzsche began the most productive and radical phase of his thinking. He would now develop his own method, his own style, and his own devastating diagnosis of European culture. With his idols abandoned, Nietzsche began the most productive and radical phase of his thinking. He would now develop his own method, his own style, and his own devastating diagnosis of European culture. In the summer of 1882, while staying in Genoa, he was writing what would become The Gay Science, a book whose title announced a kind of joyful knowledge that could only emerge after tremendous intellectual courage. Hidden in the middle of this book, in section 125, was a parable that would become the most famous passage he ever wrote. A madman runs into a marketplace in the bright morning hours, carrying a lantern, crying out that he is looking for God. The people in the marketplace, many of them already unbelievers, laugh at him. Has God gotten lost? They mock. Has he emigrated? The madman leaps into their midst and pierces them with his eyes. Where is God? He cries. I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. The madman does not stop there. He demands they understand what they have done. How did we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? This is not a celebration. The madman is not announcing good news. He describes the magnitude of what has happened with images of cosmic catastrophe, of the earth torn loose from its moorings and tumbling through empty space. And then he asks the question that reveals why he carries a lantern in daylight. Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? The death of God has plunged the world into a darkness that most people have not yet noticed. The people in the marketplace fall silent, staring at him. The madman realizes he has come too early. His deed, he says, is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. He has arrived before people understand what their own unbelief means. You might expect Nietzsche to side with the atheists in the marketplace against religious superstition, but the entire point of the parable is that these comfortable atheists have not begun to grasp what they claim to believe. They have stopped believing in God but continue living as if the Christian moral framework still holds. They still speak of truth and falsehood, good and evil, progress and purpose, as if these concepts had meaning independent of the theological structure that gave birth to them. They are living on borrowed capital, spending an inheritance they do not realize has been depleted. What Nietzsche meant by the death of God was not the biographical fact that fewer educated Europeans attended church, though that was true. He meant something far more catastrophic, the collapse of the entire edifice of transcendent meaning that had organized Western civilization for more than 1,000 years. Christianity had provided not just a story about God, but a complete metaphysical architecture. It told you why the universe exists. It gave you objective values that applied to all people in all times. It promised that your suffering had cosmic significance. It assured you that truth mattered because it reflected divine reality. It guaranteed that history was moving toward a redemptive culmination. When that structure falls, everything built upon it falls as well. You do not simply lose God, you lose the ground beneath morality, the foundation of truth claims, the framework that made individual human lives significant, the hope that justice would ultimately prevail. You are left in that infinite nothing the madman described, with no up or down, no fixed reference points, no home. The most disturbing part of Nietzsche's diagnosis was his explanation of how this happened. God did not die because of external attack. Christianity killed itself through its own highest value, intellectual honesty. For 2,000 years, Christian culture had trained people to seek truth, to examine claims carefully, to distinguish genuine belief from comfortable illusion, to follow arguments wherever they led. This rigorous truthfulness was itself a Christian virtue, a form of the ascetic ideal that demanded renunciation of easy satisfactions in favor of something higher. But eventually, this trained truthfulness turned on its own foundations. If we must question every comfortable belief, we must also question the existence of God. If we must demand evidence, we must ask what evidence supports Christian metaphysics. If we must acknowledge our capacity for self-deception, we must admit that religious belief might be wishful thinking elevated to cosmic drama. Christianity developed the intellectual conscience that would eventually recognize Christianity itself as unproven. Nietzsche saw a terrible irony here. The faith that had taught Europe to value truth above comfort had made the psychological conditions that would expose that faith as false. God died by his own hand, so to speak, through the moral demand for honesty that he supposedly commanded. This created the condition Nietzsche called nihilism, not simply the belief that nothing matters, though that would come, but the recognition that there are no objective values, no inherent meanings, no purposes written into the structure of reality. The universe does not care about human flourishing. History is not moving toward justice. There is no cosmic bookkeeper recording your virtues and vices. When you suffer, it means nothing beyond the biological fact of pain. When you die, you are erased. and the universe continues precisely as it would have if you had never existed. Most people, Nietzsche believed, had not yet felt the full weight of this realization. They still operated with Christian assumptions, even after abandoning Christian belief. They still thought some actions were objectively wrong, that human equality was self-evidently true, that compassion for the weak was obviously good, that truth should be pursued for its own sake. But all of these values, Nietzsche argued, were inheritances from a Christian worldview. Strip away the theological foundation, and why should we accept any of them? This was why the madman had come too early. The full consequence of God's death, the genuine experience of nihilism, lay somewhere in the future. Nietzsche predicted it would arrive in the 20th century, when more people would finally understand that they were drifting through infinite nothing with no compass, no map, no destination. He expected that some would collapse into despair or embrace comforting illusions. Others would fill the void with political ideologies that promised secular salvation. Many would become what he would later call the last man, seeking only comfort, security, and the avoidance of difficulty, no longer capable of creating or risking or becoming anything great. But Nietzsche was not content to simply diagnose the disease. He believed certain rare individuals could transform this catastrophe into liberation. He would call them Übermenschen, and their path would be marked by a terrifying thought experiment. Imagine a demon appeared to you in your loneliest loneliness and said, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. There will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust." Nietzsche wrote this thought experiment in The Gay Science in 1882, in section 341, titled The Greatest Weight. He presented it not as a doctrine to believe, but as a question to answer. Would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? This is eternal recurrence, and it may be the most psychologically penetrating idea Nietzsche ever conceived. The question it asks is deceptively simple. If you had to live your exact life again, infinitely many times, with no changes, no improvements, no second chances to correct mistakes, every triumph and every failure, every moment of joy and every moment of suffering repeated eternally, could you bear it? More than bear it, could you want it? Notice what Nietzsche does here. He does not ask whether eternal recurrence is true as a matter of physics or metaphysics. He does not present arguments about the nature of time or the structure of the cosmos, though in his notebooks he occasionally entertained such arguments based on the finitude of matter and the infinity of time. What matters is the psychological and existential weight of the idea. He is asking you to measure yourself against the thought itself. Your reaction reveals everything about whether you affirm or deny life. If the idea crushes you with horror, what does that tell you? It means you fundamentally wish your life had been different. It means you live with regret, with the sense that your existence is something to be endured rather than celebrated. It means you are waiting for real life to begin, or you are nostalgic for a past you imagine was better, or you are hoping for an afterlife where things will finally be put right. In other words, you have not said yes to existence as it actually is. You are living in what Nietzsche would call a state of denial, and all your values are oriented toward escape. But if you could embrace the thought, if you could genuinely wish for eternal recurrence, then you have achieved something extraordinary. You have accepted your life completely, without reserve, without the need to justify it through reference to anything outside itself. You have stopped waiting for meaning to arrive from elsewhere, and instead found existence itself valuable exactly as it is. This is what Nietzsche means by amor fati, love of fate, not resignation, not passive acceptance, but active love of everything that has happened and will happen. The difference is crucial. Most philosophical and religious systems teach you to transcend your particular existence, to see it as a stepping stone to something higher, or as an illusion to see through. or as a test to pass so you can graduate to real existence elsewhere. Christianity places ultimate value in the afterlife. Platonism places it in the eternal forms. Buddhism places it in the extinction of individual existence. Even Schopenhauer, whom Nietzsche once admired, taught that the highest wisdom was recognizing life as suffering and seeking its denial. Nietzsche rejects all of this. He demands that you find a way to love this life, this world, this body, this sequence of moments, not some purified version, not some idealized reconstruction, but exactly what happened, including the parts you wish you could change. The eternal recurrence thought experiment is a test. Are you strong enough to want your life repeated eternally? Or do you need the comfort of believing it is all leading somewhere else, somewhere better? You can see why this idea is central to understanding what Nietzsche means by overcoming nihilism. Nihilism, for him, is not simply the belief that nothing matters. It is the inevitable consequence of killing God while still maintaining God-shaped expectations. Once you realize there is no cosmic purpose, no divine plan, no transcendent meaning, the danger is that you conclude existence is therefore worthless. You wanted meaning from outside, and discovering there is none, you despair. Eternal recurrence offers an alternative. If you must live this life infinitely many times, then every moment takes on absolute weight. Nothing is merely instrumental, a means to some future end. Nothing is redeemed by contributing to progress or being part of a larger plan. Each moment matters infinitely because it will return infinitely. This is the opposite of nihilism. This is affirmation so complete that nothing needs justification beyond itself. But Nietzsche knew how difficult this affirmation would be. He knew most people could not bear the thought. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he has his animals tell Zarathustra about eternal recurrence, and Zarathustra's immediate response is nausea. The thought that the small person, the petty person, the person who lives without courage or creation, must also return eternally. This is almost unbearable. Eternal recurrence does not just bring back the heights, it brings back everything, including all the mediocrity and suffering you would prefer to forget. This is why the idea connects directly to the Übermensch. The figure Nietzsche would develop most fully in Zarathustra, only someone who has created their own values, who has overcome the need for external justification, who has transformed suffering into affirmation. Only such a person could pass the test of eternal recurrence. Only such a person could look at existence without transcendent meaning and say yes anyway. The thought of eternal recurrence would become the test by which Nietzsche measured strength, but he needed a character who could embody what it meant to pass this test, to create meaning in a meaningless universe. That character would descend from the mountains with a new teaching. The thought of eternal recurrence would become the test by which Nietzsche measured strength, but he needed a character who could embody what it meant to pass this test, to create meaning in a meaningless universe. That character would descend from the mountains with a new teaching. In the summer of 1882, while walking beside Lake Silvaplana in the Swiss Alps, Nietzsche conceived the idea for a book unlike anything he had written before. He would abandon the aphoristic style of his recent works. He would write something closer to scripture, a philosophical poem spoken by a prophet, and the prophet would be Zarathustra, the ancient Persian founder of one of humanity's first monotheistic religions, the very figure who thousands of years ago had introduced the moral categories of good and evil into human consciousness. Nietzsche found this ironically perfect. Zarathustra had created the error. Now he would return to unmake it. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was written in 4 parts between 1883 and 1885, each part composed in bursts of ecstatic productivity. Nietzsche later claimed he wrote the first part in just 10 days. The book's tone is biblical, prophetic, deliberately archaic. Zarathustra comes down from his mountain cave after 10 years of solitude to share his wisdom with humanity, much as the Buddha descended from contemplation or Moses came down with tablets. But Zarathustra brings not commandments from God. He brings the news that God is dead and that humanity must now become something it has never been. The book opens with Zarathustra's descent and his first teaching, the Übermensch. The German word is often translated as Superman or Overman, and both translations invite misunderstanding. Nietzsche did not mean a biological superior specimen, some eugenic fantasy of physical perfection. He meant something far more difficult and interesting. The Übermensch is the human who can create values in a world without God, who can affirm life without needing to believe. It serves some higher purpose, who can say yes to existence as it is, rather than pining for some imaginary world beyond. The Übermensch is not a destination but a direction, not a type but a task. Man is a rope stretched between animal and Übermensch, Zarathustra says, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. This becomes clearer in one of the book's most memorable passages, the three metamorphoses of the spirit. Zarathustra describes how the spirit must undergo three transformations to reach its fullest capacity for creation. First, the spirit becomes a camel. The camel is strong, enduring, willing to bear heavy burdens. It kneels down and says, "Load me up." This is the spirit that accepts all the values and duties society places upon it, all the thou shalts handed down by religion and tradition and morality. The camel carries these inherited meanings across the desert of life without questioning their weight. But in the loneliest desert, the second transformation occurs. The spirit becomes a lion. The lion will no longer bear burdens. The lion says, "I will," where the camel said, "I shall." The lion fights a great dragon whose scales are covered with ancient values, each one gleaming with the words, "Thou shalt." The lion must kill this dragon. It must create freedom for itself, must clear away the old values, must become capable of saying no to everything it was told was sacred. But here is the crucial limitation. The lion can destroy, but it cannot create. It can win freedom, but it does not yet know what to do with freedom. For that, a third transformation is necessary. The spirit must become a child. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. The child creates not out of resentment against the old values, not out of rebellion, but out of its own overflowing capacity for play and affirmation. The child can create new values because it is not haunted by the ghost of the values it destroyed. This is what Nietzsche means by the Übermensch, not the camel's passive acceptance, not the lion's noble destruction, but the child's active creation. Yet Zarathustra finds that humanity does not want this teaching. They do not want the danger and difficulty of becoming Übermenschen. Instead, they are becoming something else, something Zarathustra regards with barely concealed contempt, the last man. The last man is the Übermensch's opposite. Where the Übermensch embraces risk and creation, the last man seeks only comfort and security. Where the Übermensch says yes to suffering as part of life, the last man has invented happiness and blinks at the very suggestion that hardship might have value. The last man makes everything small. He wants a little pleasure in the day and a little pleasure at night, but has a regard for health. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for one needs warmth. Everyone wants the same. Everyone is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into the madhouse. This passage reveals something crucial about Nietzsche's project. He is not offering a philosophy of happiness. He is offering a philosophy of meaning, and he knows that meaning often requires precisely the discomfort the last man cannot tolerate. The last man is the triumph of mediocrity, the victory of those who would rather be comfortable than great, safe than honest. When Zarathustra describes the last man to the crowd, expecting them to recoil in horror, they instead cry out, "Give us this last man." They want exactly what he meant as a warning. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is a strange, difficult book, and Nietzsche knew it. He adopted a prophetic, poetic style that resists straightforward interpretation. The book is full of symbols, parables, songs, dreams. Zarathustra speaks in riddles and metaphors. Why did Nietzsche abandon the clarity of his earlier aphorisms for this deliberately obscure form? Perhaps because the kind of transformation he was calling for cannot be argued into existence through logic and evidence. It requires a different kind of communication, something closer to poetry or myth, something that works on the reader at a level deeper than rational argument. Or perhaps because the creation of new values is not a process that can be described in instructions. Each person must find their own path through the three metamorphoses. The best a prophet can do is gesture toward the mountain and say, "Climb." But this prophetic style created a problem that would haunt Nietzsche's legacy. The book invites misreading. Its talk of strength and weakness, of higher types and herd animals, of creating beyond good and evil can be easily twisted to justify exactly the kind of cruel domination Nietzsche despised. The very ambiguity that makes the book philosophically rich also makes it dangerous in the hands of readers looking for permission to impose their will on others. Nietzsche wanted individuals to overcome themselves, not to overcome other people. But once you write in the voice of a prophet, you lose control of how your prophecies will be used. But who had the right to create new values? And by what mechanism did some people become strong enough to affirm life while others could only resent it? Nietzsche's answer would be his most controversial concept. But who had the right to create new values? And by what mechanism did some people become strong enough to affirm life while others could only resent it? Nietzsche's answer would be his most controversial concept, one that would be twisted beyond recognition and yet remains essential to understanding what he meant by living beyond good and evil. He called it will to power, and it was not what almost anyone thinks it is. When Nietzsche wrote about will to power, he was not writing a political manifesto. He was not justifying domination, conquest, or cruelty. He was describing what he believed to be the fundamental reality of all living things, not a will to survive, not a will to pleasure, but a will to growth, expansion, and the overcoming of resistance. Every living organism seeks not merely to preserve itself, but to extend itself, to become more than it was, to increase its power over its environment and itself. This is not about one person ruling another. It is about the basic directionality of life itself. The concept emerged gradually across Nietzsche's works, but it appears most explicitly in the notes he was compiling in his final productive years. Life, he argued, is not fundamentally about self-preservation. If it were, organisms would seek the path of least resistance, minimal risk, maximum safety. But that is not what we observe. Life reaches, strives, grows, takes risks, overcomes obstacles. A tree does not merely exist, it pushes toward light, extends roots deeper, expands its crown wider. An artist does not merely satisfy basic needs, she drives herself to exhaustion perfecting her craft, seeking not comfort, but the expansion of what she can create. Will to power is the name for this fundamental drive, not power over others, but power as the capacity to affect, to create, to overcome resistance, both external and internal. You can see why this idea would be dangerous. Strip away Nietzsche's careful qualifications, ignore his subtle psychological insights, and you are left with a phrase that sounds like a justification for brutality. This is precisely what happened. Within decades of his death, will to power would be wielded as a philosophical weapon to justify exactly the kind of nationalist domination and racial hierarchy Nietzsche himself despised. The man who called anti-Semites his enemies would have his vocabulary stolen to support anti-Semitic ideology. The thinker who attacked German nationalism would be claimed as Germany's philosopher. This is not a minor historical irony. It is a tragedy that shows what happens when complex ideas are simplified into slogans. But the concept itself, properly understood, reveals something crucial about Nietzsche's method. He was not asking what values we should adopt. He was asking where values come from in the first place. And his answer was that all values, all moral systems, all judgments about good and evil express configurations of will to power. The strong create values that affirm their own qualities: courage, nobility, excellence, risk. The weak create values that protect them from the strong: compassion, humility, equality, safety. Neither set of values descends from heaven. Both emerge from the fundamental drive of life to preserve and expand itself under particular conditions. This is where the concept becomes genuinely radical. Even apparently self-denying behaviors, even asceticism and self-mortification, express will to power in disguised form. When the Christian monk fasts and prays and flagellates himself, he is not denying his will but redirecting it. He gains power over his own body, power over his impulses, the intoxicating sense of spiritual superiority over those who remain slaves to physical pleasure. The ascetic does not escape will to power. He finds a way to exercise it when external circumstances make other forms of power unavailable. The priest who cannot be a warrior becomes a different kind of warrior, wielding guilt and conscience as weapons more subtle than swords. This analysis appears throughout Nietzsche's mature work, but it receives perhaps its clearest articulation in Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886. The book's subtitle is Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, and its opening sentence announces its intention with characteristic bluntness. Supposing truth is a woman, what then? Philosophy, Nietzsche suggests, has been courting truth with all the clumsiness of a bad suitor, assuming it knows what truth wants, assuming truth will yield to earnest logical propositions. But what if truth is more elusive, more dangerous, less interested in being caught than philosophers assume? Beyond Good and Evil is structured as a series of aphorisms and short essays that dismantle the pretensions of Western philosophy with surgical precision. Nietzsche attacks the notion that philosophers are disinterested seekers of truth. Every philosophical system, he argues, is fundamentally a confession, an involuntary memoir. When Kant writes about the categorical imperative, he is not discovering a universal moral law, he is elevating his own provincial German Protestant prejudices into cosmic principle. When utilitarians argue that happiness is the highest good, they are not describing human nature, they are expressing the values of comfortable English merchants who want philosophical justification for their comfortable lives. This is the revaluation of values in action, not replacing one set of values with another, but examining how values function, where they come from, what needs they serve. Nietzsche is not telling you what to value. He is showing you that your values are not what you think they are. They did not come from God or reason or nature or the moral structure of the universe. They came from particular people in particular circumstances, with particular needs and particular drives, and those people convinced you, or your ancestors, that their values were universal truths. The project requires what Nietzsche called intellectual honesty, and he believed this was the one virtue that European culture had genuinely developed through its Christian heritage. Christianity taught believers to examine their consciences with ruthless accuracy, to suspect their own motives, to question whether their apparent virtues might be disguised vices. Eventually, this intellectual honesty turned itself against Christianity's own foundations. If we must be honest even about our own deepest beliefs, then we must eventually ask, why do we believe in God? Why do we call some things good and others evil? And when we answer these questions honestly, we discover that our beliefs serve very human purposes, express very human needs, reflect very human conditions. This is why Nietzsche insisted that his philosophy was not for everyone. Most people need the comfort of thinking their values are absolute. They need to believe that goodness and evil are built into the fabric of reality, that their judgments correspond to something beyond their own preferences and perspectives, to genuinely accept that values are human creations, that morality has a history and a psychology rather than a metaphysical foundation. This requires a kind of strength most people do not possess and probably do not want. It means standing in a world without moral anchors and deciding what you will value anyway, knowing full well that your decision creates the value rather than discovering it. The danger in all this is obvious. If there are no absolute values, if morality is just the expression of will to power in different forms, then why not simply pursue your own power without constraint? Why not dominate if you have the strength to do so? Nietzsche would say this response completely misses the point. The question is not whether you can dominate, but whether domination represents the highest expression of human possibility. And his answer, implicit throughout his work, is that the crude exercise of power over others is precisely what the mediocre do when they lack the strength for genuine self-overcoming. The Übermensch is not a tyrant. The Übermensch is an artist of existence who creates values that affirm life without requiring anyone else's degradation. But Nietzsche never completed this project. His work remained fragmentary, suggestive, deliberately incomplete. He was not building a system but performing a revaluation, showing how to question rather than what to conclude. This is perhaps why his philosophy remains so dangerous and so necessary. It offers no comfortable answers, no final truths, no system you can adopt and stop thinking. It demands that you continue the work yourself. This revaluation would reach its most systematic form in a work of psychological detection. Nietzsche would trace the genealogy of morality itself, revealing its origins not in divine command or rational principle, but in all too human emotions. This revaluation would reach its most systematic form in a work of psychological detection. Nietzsche would trace the genealogy of morality itself, revealing its origins not in divine command or rational principle, but in all too human emotions. In 1887, Nietzsche published On the Genealogy of Morals, subtitled A Polemic. The book took the form of 3 interconnected essays, each pursuing a question about the origin of moral values. But this was not history in any conventional sense. Nietzsche was doing something closer to depth psychology, excavating the buried motives and power dynamics that had crystallized into the moral concepts Europe treated as eternal truths. The question was simple and devastating. Where do our ideas of good and evil actually come from, and what do their origins tell us about what they really mean? The first essay asked how the concepts of good and evil emerged in the first place. Nietzsche argued that originally there were 2 fundamentally different ways of creating values, which he called master morality and slave morality. These were not moral theories, but psychological orientations, ways that different types of people related to themselves and the world. Master morality was the value system of the strong, the noble, the powerful. In this mode, the powerful defined themselves as good. Good meant everything they were: strong, healthy, proud, capable of action, life-affirming. The opposite of good was not evil but simply bad, which meant weak, sick, common, incapable. This was not a moral judgment in our sense. It was more like aesthetic distaste. The noble type looked at the weak and felt roughly what you might feel looking at spoiled food, a simple revulsion, but nothing resembling hatred or obsession. The weak were beneath notice, not worthy of sustained attention. This master morality was fundamentally affirmative. It said yes to itself first and only then defined everything else in relation to that primary self-affirmation. The strong did not need the weak to exist in order to feel good about themselves. Their sense of value came from within, from their own power and vitality. Slave morality operated by entirely different logic. Here, Nietzsche argued, the weak and powerless could not simply affirm themselves because they lacked the strength and vitality to do so. Instead, they began by defining their oppressors as evil. Evil meant everything the powerful were: strong, proud, capable of cruelty, indifferent to suffering. Only after defining the powerful as evil did the weak define themselves as good by being the opposite: humble, compassionate, selfless, suffering. Notice the structure. Slave morality is fundamentally reactive and negative. It begins with no, with negation, with defining what one is against. The slave type needs the master to exist, needs an enemy, because their entire value system is constructed in opposition to someone else. Where the master says, I am good, therefore you are bad. The slave says, you are evil, therefore I am good. The difference is profound. Nietzsche argued that slave morality emerged from a specific historical source, the Jewish priestly caste during the periods of exile and oppression. Here were people of considerable intelligence and sophistication, who found themselves politically and militarily powerless. They could not defeat Rome through force. They could not overthrow their oppressors through action, so they achieved victory through a revaluation of values itself. The priests declared that strength, pride, and power were evil. Weakness, humility, and suffering became good. This was what Nietzsche called a slave revolt in morality. The Jews, he argued, had inverted the value system of their masters and then convinced the world that this inversion represented absolute moral truth. Christianity inherited and intensified this inversion, spreading it throughout Europe until master morality almost disappeared beneath the universal acceptance of slave values. The psychological mechanism that made this possible.
Nietzsche called resentment.
The word is French, and he used it deliberately because the German equivalent lacked the precise psychological nuance he wanted. Resentment is not simple resentment. It is the particular form of hatred that emerges when you are too weak to act on your anger. When you are strong and someone wrongs you, you strike back immediately and then forget about it. The action discharges the emotion, but when you are powerless, you cannot strike back. The anger has nowhere to go. It turns inward and becomes a permanent part of your psyche, festering, growing, transforming into something far more dangerous than simple rage. Resentment is creative. It creates new values, new concepts, new ways of interpreting the world that transform your weakness into virtue and your enemy's strength into vice. This is why slave morality centers on concepts like sin, guilt, and divine judgment. If you cannot punish your oppressors yourself, you imagine a God who will punish them for you. If you cannot achieve power and pleasure in this life, you invent an afterlife where the last shall be first. Every doctrine of slave morality serves to console the powerless and promise that their weakness is actually strength, their suffering actually redemption, their inability to act actually moral superiority. The second essay examined how guilt and bad conscience developed. Here Nietzsche traced an even stranger transformation. He argued that humans were originally animals like any others, acting on instinct without internal moral conflict. But civilization required suppressing many natural instincts. You cannot have a functioning society if everyone acts on every aggressive or sexual impulse immediately. The instincts could not simply disappear. Instead, they turned inward. The human animal who could no longer discharge cruelty outward began to practice it on himself. This was the origin of bad conscience, the internalization of cruelty, the soul becoming sick with itself. Guilt was not some transcendent moral category, but the psychic infection that resulted when natural aggressive drives were blocked from external expression and began eating away at the self from within. Christianity, Nietzsche argued, had weaponized this sickness. It taught humans to see their natural instincts as sinful, to feel guilty for desires and impulses that were simply biological facts. It promised redemption through a God whose Son had suffered for human sins, creating an eternal unpayable debt that kept believers in a permanent state of guilty self-torture. The religion of love, Nietzsche suggested, was actually a religion of self-hatred, of resentment turned against the self. You can feel the intensity building in these essays. Nietzsche was not simply making historical claims. He was diagnosing what he saw as a civilizational sickness. Europe had inherited a moral system built on negation, on the denial of life, on the transformation of natural strength into sin, and most people did not even know they were sick because the sickness had become normal, had become morality itself. The genealogical method was crucial because it revealed that moral concepts were not eternal truths handed down by God or discovered by reason. They were human creations with specific historical origins and psychological functions, and once you understood their origins, you could no longer believe in them the same way. Knowing that good and evil emerge from the resentment of the powerless did not automatically tell you what to do, but it made it impossible to treat those concepts as absolute. This genealogical method revealed something shocking. The values Western civilization held most sacred were born from weakness, masquerading as virtue. As Nietzsche's thought reached its peak intensity, so did his rhetoric, until in his final productive year, he would write with barely contained fury. 1888 began with Nietzsche in high spirits, and ended with him signing letters as Dionysus and the Crucified One. Between those 2 points, he produced 3 books that read like the work of a man trying to say everything he had left to say before time ran out. He could not have known what was coming, but the velocity of his writing that year suggests some intuition that the window was closing. He wrote with fury, with clarity, with increasing grandiosity. The question scholars still debate is whether these final works represent the culmination of his philosophical vision or the first signs of mental disintegration. Perhaps they are both. Twilight of the Idols came first, written in September and published in January of 1889. The subtitle tells you what Nietzsche intended: how to philosophize with a hammer. This was not an extended meditation, but a series of short, sharp strikes against everything he believed had weakened European thought. The title itself mocks Wagner's opera Twilight of the Gods, and the method is deliberately provocative. Nietzsche called it sounding out idols, tapping philosophical concepts with a hammer to hear which ones ring hollow. Most of them, he concluded, were completely empty. The book covers extraordinary ground in brief compass. He attacks Socrates again, that ancient corrupter who convinced Athens that reason could improve humanity. He dissects the concept of the real world versus the apparent world, showing how this distinction poisoned Western philosophy from Plato through Kant. He offers a compressed account of his own philosophy, the revaluation of all values, the critique of morality, the demand for life affirmation. One section presents maxims and arrows, aphoristic strikes so condensed they barely need explanation. "What does not kill me makes me stronger" appears here, a line now so overused it has lost its original ferocity. Nietzsche meant it psychologically. The person who survives suffering without bitterness has transformed pain into strength. Most people, he knew, are simply broken by hardship. What makes Twilight of the Idols remarkable is its clarity. After the poetic obscurity of Zarathustra and the complexity of Beyond Good and Evil, here was Nietzsche making his case with brutal directness. The problem with Western civilization, he argued, was its 2,000-year war against the senses, against the body, against this world. From Plato's Forms to Christianity's Heaven, European thought had taught people to despise the only existence they actually have. The error begins with dividing reality into a true world we cannot experience and an apparent world we can. Once you make that move, you have poisoned the well. The world we live in becomes at best a shadow, at worst a prison. Nietzsche wanted to abolish the true world entirely and rehabilitate this one. The title's Twilight is not apocalyptic, but liberating. The idols are falling, and good riddance. Then came the Antichrist, written in September, but not published until 1895. If Twilight of the Idols struck idols with a hammer, the Antichrist attacked Christianity with a sword. Nietzsche had criticized Christian morality for years, but always somewhat indirectly, embedded in larger arguments about slave morality or ressentiment. Here he made Christianity itself the target, calling it the one great curse, the one great intrinsic depravity, the one great instinct for revenge, for which no expedient is sufficiently poisonous, secret, subterranean, petty. These are not the words of measured philosophical critique. The book's central argument is that Christianity represents a systematic devaluation of life in favor of an imaginary afterlife. It teaches the sick, the suffering, and the failures that their weakness is actually virtue, that the powerful are evil, that this world is corrupt and the next one is paradise. This is worse than honest nihilism, Nietzsche insisted, because nihilism at least acknowledges that nothing has inherent meaning. Christianity claims to provide meaning while actually poisoning people against the only existence they have. It convinces them to bear suffering not by becoming stronger, but by calling suffering good. It turns resentment into righteousness. The meek will inherit the earth becomes not a revolutionary promise, but a narcotic that keeps people from demanding the earth now. Nietzsche saw Christianity as a slave revolt that succeeded so completely it became invisible. It convinced even the powerful that compassion for the weak was the highest virtue, that humility was admirable, that this life was merely preparation for the real one. In doing so, it drained European culture of vitality. The Christian ideal of the good person, selfless and suffering and meek, was really the profile of someone too weak to assert themselves. The religion of love was built on hatred of life. You can feel the intensity escalating. The Antichrist does not argue so much as denounce. Nietzsche's diagnosis may be psychologically acute, but the tone has moved beyond philosophy into something more personal. He was not just critiquing a moral system, he was declaring war. Then in October came Ecce Homo, a book so strange it is difficult to know how to read it. The subtitle is How One Becomes What One Is, and the chapter titles give you the flavor: Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, Why I Am a Destiny. This is autobiography, a self-mythology. Nietzsche reviews his own works, explaining what he accomplished in each one and why no one understood them. He praises his diet. He discusses his preferences in climate and weather. He describes himself as not a man but dynamite, claiming that when truth enters into struggle with the lies of millennia, we shall have upheavals, a convulsion of earthquakes, a moving of mountains and valleys, the like of which has never been dreamed of. The grandiosity is undeniable, but it is also oddly self-aware. Nietzsche knew how this sounded. At times he seems to be performing grandiosity, demonstrating what it looks like when someone fully embraces their own significance without false modesty. At other times he seems genuinely convinced that he is the hinge of history, the figure who has diagnosed European decline and prescribed the cure. Both readings might be true simultaneously. Genius often lacks perspective on itself, and Nietzsche had spent years in almost complete intellectual isolation, his books selling in the dozens, his ideas dismissed or ignored. Perhaps by 1888 he needed to tell himself he was dynamite because no one else was saying it. The book is brilliant in places and disturbing in others. His analysis of his own works shows deep understanding of what he was attempting philosophically. His recounting of personal habits is sometimes comical, but the overall tone suggests a man whose sense of proportion has begun to slip. When he writes that he is not a man but dynamite, when he calls himself a destiny, when he predicts global convulsions from his philosophy, he is either correct in ways his contemporaries could not see, or he is beginning to lose the thread. The ambiguity is what makes Ecomo so difficult. Is this the final clarification of a philosophical project reaching completion, or is it the sound of a mind beginning to fracture under the weight of its own intensity? 3 months after writing Ecce Homo, Nietzsche collapsed in that street in Turin. What followed was not death, but something harder to witness. A living erasure, as the man who had demanded humanity overcome itself was reduced to incapacity, cared for like a child by the very Christian virtues of compassion he had spent his life attacking. 3 months after writing Ecce Homo, Nietzsche collapsed in that street in Turin. What followed was not death, but something harder to witness. A living erasure, as the man who had demanded humanity overcome itself was reduced to incapacity, cared for by the very Christian virtues of compassion he had spent his life attacking. For 11 years he lingered, silent and absent, while his ideas began their strange and troubled journey into the 20th century. The philosopher who had written with such ferocious clarity about the dangers of misinterpretation would become perhaps the most catastrophically misunderstood thinker in Western philosophy. His sister Elizabeth became the keeper of his legacy, and it is difficult to imagine a less appropriate guardian where Friedrich had been cosmopolitan. Elizabeth was nationalist. Where he had despised anti-Semitism and called it the ruin of all good relationships, Elizabeth had married Bernhard Förster, a prominent anti-Semite, and attempted to found an Aryan colony in Paraguay. The colony failed spectacularly. Her husband killed himself, and Elizabeth returned to Germany in 1893 to find her brother's reputation beginning to grow. She saw opportunity. Elizabeth took control of Nietzsche's literary estate and set about curating his image. She selectively edited his letters, removing passages that contradicted the narrative she wanted to construct. She discouraged the publication of works that did not fit her vision. Most consequentially, she compiled fragments from his notebooks, many of them early drafts or ideas he had explicitly abandoned, and published them in 1901 as The Will to Power, attempt at a revaluation of all values. The book presented itself as Nietzsche's systematic magnum opus, the culmination of his philosophy. It was nothing of the sort. It was Elizabeth's Nietzsche, arranged to suggest a philosophy far more concerned with hierarchy, domination, and racial superiority than the actual published work's support. When scholars later gained access to the notebooks themselves, they discovered the extent of her manipulation. She had rearranged passages, altered emphasis, and created a false chronology. The Will to Power is now considered an editorial fabrication, but for decades it shaped how Nietzsche was read, and when the Nazis came to power, they found in Elizabeth's version of her brother a prophet of their racial ideology. The Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche remains one of the most grotesque misreadings in intellectual history, and also one of the most understandable if you only read selectively. Take the Übermensch out of context. Ignore everything Nietzsche wrote about genuine nobility of spirit, reduce will to power to crude domination, and you can construct a philosopher of might makes right. Hitler visited Elizabeth at the Nietzsche archive in Weimar. She gave him her brother's walking stick. Photographs show the Führer gazing reverently at a bust of the philosopher. Nietzsche's concepts entered Nazi propaganda, stripped of all nuance, transformed into slogans for a movement that represented everything his actual philosophy opposed. The irony is almost too perfect. Nietzsche had called Germans the most backward people in Europe. He had denounced nationalism as a sickness and unreason. He had written that anti-Semites were bungled and botched specimens unfit for his philosophy. He had praised Jewish culture and condemned the German Reich's power politics. In Ex Homo, he had explicitly stated, "I am not a man, I am dynamite," and warned that terrible simplifiers would try to use his ideas for causes he despised. He could not have been more clear. They used him anyway. After the war, Nietzsche's philosophy needed rehabilitation. The work began with Walter Kaufmann, a philosopher who had fled Nazi Germany and understood intimately what happened when Nietzsche was misread. His 1950 book Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist systematically demonstrated the distance between what Nietzsche actually wrote and what the Nazis claimed he meant. Kaufmann's translations, particularly of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, became standard in English and shaped how a generation of scholars approached the texts. He revealed a Nietzsche concerned with individual self-overcoming, not racial purity, with intellectual honesty, not political domination. French philosophy took Nietzsche in different directions. Gilles Deleuze, in his 1962 Nietzsche and Philosophy, read him as a philosopher of multiplicity and difference, opposed to all systems that reduced life to simple categories. Michel Foucault found in Nietzsche a method for genealogical analysis, a way of revealing how power and knowledge construct what societies call truth. Jacques Derrida explored the complexity of Nietzsche's styles, the way his shifting perspectives destabilized any attempt at systematic interpretation. These thinkers recovered a Nietzsche who questioned, destabilized, and problematized rather than one who proclaimed answers. What emerged from this rehabilitation was not a single Nietzsche, but several. There is Nietzsche the existentialist, concerned with authentic individual existence. Nietzsche the postmodernist, demonstrating that all truths are interpretations. Nietzsche the psychologist, revealing hidden motives beneath conscious beliefs. Nietzsche the proto-fascist, though this reading now finds little scholarly support. Nietzsche the life-affirming artist. Nietzsche the nihilist. Nietzsche the anti-nihilist. The multiplication of Nietzsches might have appalled him, or perhaps he would have recognized it as the inevitable fate of any philosophy written in aphorisms and parables rather than systematic arguments. But what does Nietzsche's philosophy actually offer to someone encountering it now, freed from both Nazi distortion and academic specialization? Not a system, certainly, not answers. What it offers is a method and a challenge. The method is genealogical when confronted with any value, any belief, any supposedly self-evident truth. Ask where it comes from, not whether it is true in some abstract sense, but what human needs, what historical circumstances, what power relations produced it and keep it in place. This does not automatically invalidate the value. It simply removes its claim to be anything other than a human creation. The challenge is existential. Can you live without foundations? Can you accept that there is no cosmic endorsement for your values, no objective moral law written into the universe, no guarantee that your life means anything beyond what you make it mean? And having accepted this, can you then create your own meaning, your own values, with full knowledge that they are your creation and nothing more? Or will you, consciously or unconsciously, invent new foundations to replace the ones you lost, trading God for progress or nature or history or science, unwilling to face the vertigo of genuine groundlessness? Nietzsche believed most people cannot do this. They will choose comfortable illusions over uncomfortable truths. They will become last men, seeking security and pleasure, avoiding risk and difficulty. slowly diminishing, until nothing great or terrible or beautiful seems worth the cost. The question his philosophy asks is not whether this is morally wrong. The question is whether you find this prospect suffocating, and if you do, whether you are willing to pay the price of living without the consolations that make most human lives bearable. That price includes loneliness, because values you create yourself are not shared by the herd. It includes the constant possibility of error, because you have no divine guidance to correct your course. It includes the weight of responsibility, because you cannot blame your failures on circumstances or fate or original sin. And it includes the knowledge that your creations will die with you, that there is no progress toward which your efforts contribute, no kingdom of ends where your sacrifices are redeemed. What you get in return is integrity, the fierce joy of honest creation, and the affirmation that your life was yours. Whether this trade is worthwhile depends entirely on who you are. Nietzsche's philosophy is not for everyone, because not everyone values the same things. Some people genuinely prefer security to growth, comfort to intensity, peace to struggle. Nietzsche would say these people should not read him. His philosophy is for those who cannot stop questioning, who find inherited answers insufficient, who would rather live dangerously than safely. If you are not such a person, there is no shame in that. But if you are, Nietzsche offers you no escape from your nature. He only offers you the tools to understand it and the courage to embrace it. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy leaves us, standing in a world without God, without absolute values, without cosmic purpose, asked to decide whether we will fill that absence with new creations or collapse into the comfort of the last man. The question was never whether his answers were right. The question was whether we are strong enough to live with his questions.